Are you having fun?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'll try not to ruin that. And we're definitely not going to be talking about the word that begins with B, ends in T, and has an X in the middle. That is totally banned from this conference, I hope, for most of today. And I'm sorry I've got to run, but this really is a bit diversity central day today. So I've just been hosting a breakfast with Nicky Morgan, the fantastic new chair of the Treasury Select Committee, whose commitment to diversity is just quite profound. In fact, if you ever find yourself in the situation where you or your lords and masters are in front of her in the Treasury Select Committee, she's asking you, what are you doing about women in finance? And she's asking every single person that turns up from the financial services sector, what are you doing about women and finance? Have you signed the Women in Finance Charter? What's going on? So she's going to kind of carry on with that. And then I'm skedaddling away from this great event. I'd much rather stay at BAFTA. I got my picture with BAFTA earlier. I compared him to Oscar. BAFTA, Oscar, I don't know, it's a LGBT thing. I have no idea. I'm going to an event that I never would have thought, Michelle, would have been ever on the agenda a few years ago, and that's the business and diplomatic community having a conversation about what's going on diversity. So it's great to be having this conversation. So can I maybe ask, just before I get into it, who feels kind of comfortable, confident with the diversity conversation? Who feels that their organization's really getting on with it? Right, and by dint of who feels that organization really isn't getting on with it? You don't necessarily need to put your hand up, but that feels like just about 30–40% of the room. So what I'm delighted about is that most of the room, maybe even half the room, is maybe coming to this conversation for the first time. And, you know, candidly, you know, I've done that too. If I can make the clicker work. Yeah, there we go. I've done that too. So I am a diva. I am a gay man, but I've never really, until the last 2 or 3 years or so, projected that, certainly in business terms. I probably did what lots of people who are gay do, and I'm going to come back to some rather horrific statistics on that, which is not exactly hide your sexuality. I don't hide my sexuality in any way, shape, or form, but we didn't bring it into the workplace. And that was, I think, particularly sort of essentially true of the financial services sector. Very, very alpha male in places, very driven by things like the bonus culture. As Nicky Morgan said this morning, if we'd had Lehman Sisters, what might have happened? And I think it is a very, very, very good point that she makes. But you know, I inevitably want to talk to you for 5 or 6 minutes just now, and then we're going to have a bit of a chit chat together about, you know, really what being an LGBT person has meant, an out LGBT person has meant as somebody who's running a business, a small business. I employ 60 people in the financial sector, and that may resonate for many of you in the room. So I've kind of called this, you know, SMEs can't do diversity, can they? This sense that it's only really big co with large talent teams, HR, whatever you want to call it, that actually has the bandwidth to get into the conversation. Now, that is not me in a pram, but it could be, given my new description as a diva. I mean, the LGBT debate, I feel particularly passionate about, not least because I was born just 1 year after the Sexual Offences Act in 1967. So I'm coming up for a rather big birthday later this year. And that does put a lot of things into perspective for me. It is only 50 years, just over 50 years now, since homosexual acts between 2 men were decriminalized in our law. But as a Scotsman, I've got to remind everybody that homosexuality was not decriminalized until 1980. When you think about that fact, it's still quite astounding, really. And homosexuality wasn't decriminalized in Northern Ireland until 1982. And I think, as we know, we look at the contours of our political debate, there's a huge conversation that still takes place in Northern Ireland about being gay. So it's only relatively recently that a lot of this conversation has taken place, and it's very, very recently that a lot of this conversation has gone in to the workplace. And when you look back to the kind of gay pride marches that were there just after the legislation was passed, because you couldn't go and do that in the streets in the 1960s without having a really big, bad problem. The tone and the texture of pride marches now are entirely different. If I told you that at last year's Pride March, which I was delighted to be bouncing around on the Aviva bus with, and I was bouncing around on the Aviva bus, there were some very good cocktails going on, as I remember. But there was not just the UK CEO, but there was Mark Wilson, the global CEO of Aviva, bouncing around on the Pride bus. And I told you as well that a third of the FTSE was represented on the Pride bus. That's just how quickly this debate is changing. And I think just watching the Twitter feed from the conference earlier, some of the stuff that Helena was talking to you about is exactly why this is changing, and I think why rooms like this are getting more and more filled. I mean, I spoke at the Pride weekend at the Institute of Directors. It's in the headlines today for the wrong reasons, maybe, but I spoke at the headlines at the event with the Institute of Directors around the Pride weekend. A massive, great rainbow flag flying outside a traditional Pall Mall institution. I never thought I would see that, and it's happening very, very quickly. But the numbers are still fairly horrible. Did you know that when folks graduate and they go into the world of work, 70% of them go back in the closet? 70% of them. Did you know for financial services, the number is 78%? For me, that's still quite a terrifying statistic. And for somebody who believes that, I think as many of us do in this room, that you can only be successful, you can only reach the kind of heights of your career by being authentically yourself, I think those numbers, for me, remain quite terrifying. And a lot of it for financial services is due to this kind of, as I say, alpha imagery. I couldn't resist a picture of Gordon Gekko. It is a great movie. But you watch that movie back, and those behaviors and those stereotypes are essentially what lots of people, lots of kids that might be thinking about a career in finance, they still think that's true. And let's be honest with ourselves, in many cases it is. Presenteeism, the fact that it's very, very hard for women, actually, particularly when they have the time to go and create a family, to get back into the workplace, stay in the workplace, and rise further in the workplace. It's still absolutely the exception rather than rule. And I think that imagery is kind of a large part of it, and it's certainly a large part of why people can't be out as an LGBT person. And again, I know you've thought about this earlier, but this one's pretty redolent for me, that, yeah, while boards are changing, and Hampton Alexander has done a lot to push change, lots of FTSE boards are getting on with that, what's happening in the vast majority of our businesses? Are women, are BAME folks, are LGBT people actually getting a conversation? Are they round these tables, or are we just doing the numbers? Are we just doing a bit of rainbow wash or a bit of diversity wash? Those are quite hard questions, and the gender pay gap for me is the start of very, very hard measures that are now going to be asked of businesses as to whether or not they are actually reflecting a diverse society, and they're reflecting what their customers, increasingly obviously millennial customers that have buying power and have a voice, and have a very noisy voice, actually want. And those customers are voting with their feet. They're moving on. They're absolutely moving on. They're ditching brands that, I mean, Sports Direct probably being the most outrageous and egregious example, that have deliberately set their face against the diversity agenda. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other issues to talk about with Sports Direct, but Sports Direct is I'm afraid, probably the poster boy, I'm afraid, of this conversation. So my kind of final point, Michelle, really is, you're an SME, you're trying to actually display the values, whether you're running a client business, I run a B2B business, you're running a business where you want people to come and work with you. And in financial services, you're kind of really concerned about how to do it. You don't have an HR team. You don't have the bandwidth. Well, I think there's a whole variety of places that you can now go, whether it's the 30% Club, whether or not it's Stonewall, whether or not it's groups like the IOD. I've just been asked to chair something for the IOD on the LGBT agenda. This is suddenly breaking out all over the place. There's much, much more signposting. I hope it's a really big reason why you're here today. And look, do you want to now have a conversation with Aviva? Thank you very much.
I am equally as a diva as you, so let's do this. Thank you, everybody. Obviously, thank you very much, Iain. We've had some corking questions. Now, we've literally got 9 minutes. He's got to dash out the door, so I'm going to be quick. So this is anonymous. Iain, as a business owner, why is it important that I know the sexuality of my employees?
Yeah, so this is not about forcing people out. This is absolutely not about forcing people out. It's pretty obvious when somebody walks in as a woman. It's pretty obvious when somebody walks in as a BAME person. So my agenda, and I do have an agenda in business, beyond my business, is not about saying to people, you have to come out. What it is about doing is creating the conditions in your business, creating the signaling, to some extent being a role model and championing. If you want to come out, that's great. If you don't want to come out, that's equally great. But nobody is going to judge you.
No, that's the point.
Nobody is going to judge you.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. It's quite remarkable how many times I've been asked if I was a lesbian. And I think it's the hair. But, and it's, there's loads
great
of
hair, by the way. Actually.
Thanks.
Really great
it's the lines.
Love the hair.
Right. This is from Amira, how can employers empower employees and vice versa, not to hide in companies and be more open about their lives, families and health?
So I go back to this. I mean, this is essentially about leadership again. So I think you've got to provide the right signalling. I mean, we're also at Cicero doing what we call our MENA project, a big piece for us, at least, on mental health. Yeah. If people aren't talking about diversity, they're certainly talking about mental health in the workplace. So we've been doing kind of lunchtime sessions. We've been doing lunchtime sessions too on diversity as well. And another really big component for me is finding the mentoring piece. So there are a couple of people in my business that are not out. They're absolutely not out, but they've flagged through our talent mechanism the ability to want to have the conversation. Yeah. Now, whether or not they're gay or straight, I really don't give a damn about. But if they want to go and find some support from some of the organisations that I've put up there for us as an SME, we can't do it all. Then we help them in terms of the signposting. The most important thing, I think, is that any person feels that they can have a candid conversation and there's not suddenly some black mark that's emerged on their employee file because they've had that candid conversation.
So presumably, when in any organisation, including your own, it must feel like a safe place to be. I can imagine they would be a lot more open with you. Do you think that's key? That the leaders in these organisations almost empower their teams to create a safe environment that everything's okay?
No, you've got to enforce it. Yeah. I mean, it's like you've got to enforce what you're doing on gender. You've got to enforce what you're doing in terms of training. Look, I had a very hard conversation with a colleague about 3 years ago who said to me, why are you banging on about diversity? Can't we just get back to the real business? And I said, look, It's really quite simple. You can either stay involved in this conversation or you can go find somewhere else to work.
See ya.
You know, and that's quite hard for some people. And actually, you know, this person's become the, you know, the sort of typical kind of evangelist of the convert. But I think you've got to be quite steely about this. I mean, you know, it's the old, if you don't measure it, it doesn't happen thing. And if you don't show leadership from the very top on some of this stuff, people will just think it's not valued.
Yeah, there's a cracking question. I can't quite get it on my list, but I know what it is. So, you know, it's coming from Anonymous. You know, when people are advertising and they're recruiting, you know, what wording or specific information, which sounds odd in itself saying that, but almost what could go into these adverts and these job postings to confirm that it's a safe, open, you know, all shapes and sizes.
I mean, you've kind of almost used the words. I mean, you know, which is to basically flag absolutely upfront things like signatory to women in finance. I mean, I think particularly relevant for this conversation, that you sign up to being a Stonewall employer. That you know, so you don't actually need to say to somebody, and you can't say something to somebody. It's beyond the legislation. I think actually quite rightly, it's beyond the legislation to turn around and say, you know, we're looking for a BAME person, we're looking for an LGBT person, we're looking for a woman. You can't say that. But what you can really positively signal is that you're involved in some of this stuff, and people. You know, if they're bright people, and I think you want to employ bright people, they're going to come to their own conclusions about the values of your own organisation. Yeah,
and presumably then you've got to kind of put your money where your mouth is and prove it when they're in. It can't just be words on a bit of paper, can it?
You absolutely have to prove it when you're in, and I think you know, for me that's a case of providing the mentoring opportunities, but also, and I think this principle actually works from a sort of managing people thing across the piece, which is early intervention when you sniff, and I think many of us really can in small businesses because we're so close to our teams, when you can sniff that there's something going wrong.
Yeah, and kind of go all balls out and confront it.
Confront it. Yeah. Confront it. You know, we all know. You know, there are very few problems in life that just fall off the table. all the problem does is just become a bigger problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So deal with it.
Deal with it.
Yeah. Fabulous. Last question. This is from John. Change can seem daunting. What would you recommend as the first step in creating that open and safe environment? I love that question. Good job, John.
So I think you've got to say that to your business. You've got to say that to your customers. And I think you know, quite a profound thought that was in my head was particularly thinking about financial services, where are people that I employ, are my clients going to run away because I'm getting quite upfront about some of this stuff. And I've seen precisely the opposite. Yeah. So I'm afraid it's nothing more complicated than the right signalling, and you know, really demonstrating all the time that this is not a box ticking piece. No. It's not just about customer. It's a completely holistic, internal and customer facing piece. It's not what a lot of people rocked up to me because I bounced around on some of this stuff before Pride, and they said, "Oh yeah, we should be doing our Pride float." I said, "Well, sounds great. What are the drinks like?" So I chose Aviva, but the reason I chose Aviva is because Aviva have been getting on with this for quite some time. Yeah. You're going to get quite a big backlash from the LGBT community or the BAME community in other, if this is seen to be just marketing wash. Yeah. It's got to be authentic, and the only way it's going to be authentic is if you do it inside your own organisation.
Totally. Inside out.
Inside out, very good.
Yeah.
I'll nick that.
Outside in. That's fine. You can have that. One diva to another. Can we have a round of applause for Iain, please?
Thank you very much.